My name is Joanne, I'm Vice Mayor. But first, I want us to reflect for a moment on the innocent victims from 9/11 terrorist attack 18 years ago. Culver City have started the work on its general plan, and part of that we started a speaker series a year ago to highlight and discuss critical issues affecting the city, the region and beyond. And I would like to thank Ashley Hefner for managing this program with the rest of the staff. We really appreciate this, and my colleague Thomas Small, who is a council member, former mayor, who was part of getting this going, so thank you. Today we welcome Joanne Hovis for a presentation on broadband strategies and opportunities. Joanne is president of CTC Technology and Energy. It's a woman-owned consulting firm that offers a unique combination of qualifications and capabilities in engineering and network strategy planning, broadband financial analysis and business planning. She's also the CEO of the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, CLIC. The coalition represents a wide range of public and private interests who support the authority of local communities to make the broadband internet choice that are essential for economic competitiveness, democratic discourse, and quality of life in the 21st century. Joanne will discuss how municipal fiber can bring value to our community. The world of fiber connections reaching neighborhoods, homes, and businesses will represent as great a change from what came before as the advent of electricity. This might sound like big change when you compare to the electricity that can fiber really do that, but yes, it will. You will understand some, I think, when we hear from Joanne. But it is a major shift. It really allows for a lot of technology to be introduced into our society. So she will discuss how the public sector can build strategies and opportunities for private-public partnerships in broadband. Opportunities for Culver Connect, which is our network that we as a municipality has invested in and built out here in our city, and it's lit up and up and running as we speak. So that will primarily go to our businesses for now, and we will see how we can take it to another level. We don't know. So we will hear from Joanne on those ideas and what we could do with our network. So with that, I know you all want to hear Joanne, so please welcome Joanne Hovis.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Can you all hear me? Okay. I am much too short to sit behind a podium. I turn out to be too short for this microphone also. For the video, do you need me to use the microphone, or can I travel away from it? Okay.
Probably be best to stay on the microphone.
Best to stay on the microphone. Okay.
You can see if it takes out.
I may have to pull up your tape. Apologies. Okay. All right. How's that? Better? All right. You can all hear me. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's always a pleasure to be in Culver City, and I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you tonight about broadband and the infrastructure investment that you are making as a community in your future, and how it fits into a broader picture of what this infrastructure and these services mean for our communities, and how it fits into a broader national and global structure as well. What does this mean? How does this compare to what other communities are doing and to what other markets have available to them, is part of what I'll discuss as well. But I want you to think about something that Vice Mayor Erickson just said that is so important and so consequential, which is to make the analogy between broadband and in particular fiber optics, which I'm going to talk about a lot tonight because that is the infrastructure at the heart of Culver Connect. But the analogy between fiber optics and electrification and the infrastructure that was built to electrify the nation about 100 years ago. 100 years ago in some places, 70 to 80 years ago in other places, particularly rural areas. But that analogy is enormously consequential, not because these are the same services, or not, they're analogous in many ways, but they're not the same. And not just because broadband is the electricity of the 21st century, and it is very much that, but because electricity and the electrical infrastructure that we built 100 years ago was something that we understood at the time was going to be really important to our long-term well-being as a nation, but we didn't fully understand. In fact, we didn't even come close to understanding what it was really going to mean. We built out the electrical grid for electric light. We built it so that we would have light indoors at night. That was the primary driver and the primary business case for building that network all those years ago. Think of what it enabled in the subsequent century. 100 years of American prosperity is built on that infrastructure. Just wild examples, and there are a million that you can think of, literally a million, I'm not exaggerating, but when the electric grid was built in that time period in the early 20th century, late 19th century, nobody ever imagined the washing machine, the dryer, and the vacuum cleaner. Three things that fundamentally changed the lives of American women in the middle of the 20th century that would have been inconceivable without an investment that had been made decades earlier, with no sense of the fact that those things would exist. Nobody ever imagined the answering machine, the fax machine, the dial-up modem, the cable modem, the internet, and everything that it has enabled. But all of that is inconceivable without electric power. We built the infrastructure for an immediate need that was electric light, with the understanding that it would lead to other things, but without any kind of full realization of just how consequential it would be. And that's exactly where we are in the current moment in building communications infrastructure. We know we have a need for it. We know we're all using it. Every single one of us here use the internet today, and many of us will use the internet before we go to sleep tonight, in many ways, in hundreds of ways every day. But in the same way as even 10 years ago we couldn't contemplate what Facebook might mean in our lives, we can't imagine what broadband infrastructure is going to mean in our lives 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and 50 years from now. And I'm a broadband planner. This is what I do. I've been doing it since the advent of the commercial internet in the mid-1990s. But when I am asked to do projections of what the broadband internet will look like even 10 years from now, I am very cautious about saying I can do that, because I don't think we can yet imagine. It is an infrastructure that, much like electric power, opens doors that we don't even know the shape of, and we don't know the color of, and we don't know the potential of. And that's part of the power of it. We have a business case for it today, we have a need for it today, but part of the reason we build it is also because we don't understand what the needs of tomorrow are, and particularly the distant tomorrows that this is going to be so transformative around. So thank you for the analogy to electric power, because it made me start thinking about what an important framing mechanism that is for understanding the consequences of what we're talking about here. And it's not just about Facebook and streaming Netflix, although a lot of it is about that for many of us, many days. But it's a much broader set of issues. So let me suggest one more thing, also as a kind of starting point before we jump in. And by the way, as an aside, let me invite you all to speak up with questions and comments at any time. We have 90 minutes, and I've been asked to speak for 60 and take questions for 30. I'm happy to mix that 90 minutes up with questions and comments, and very much welcome everybody's perspective. So don't hesitate, please. And there's one already.
You said you hesitate to guess what things might be like in 25 years. But if you were to guess something, Jules Verne like that you...
it would be reckless for me to try to guess at what that might look like. I want to be honest with you. I don't think I can do that. I think there are plenty of people who will style themselves as futurists, who will say that they do know what that looks like, and I think they're going to be very successful in selling books. But do we really know? No. I think an enormous amount of it is speculation. And I use Facebook as an example, and it's sort of a trivial example in some ways, right? Facebook is a dynamic of the last 10 years, and I don't mean to demean Facebook or diminish Facebook. I'm sure it's very, in fact, it's enormously consequential. It's had huge impact in our world, but it wasn't developed to change the world. It was really developed as a commercial matter, and for many of us, it's really just like a fun way to spend time. Now, its consequences have been utterly massive in many ways, some of them better, some of them worse. But the things of broad consequence that we can't contemplate, I think, are the areas where there's enormous opportunity and enormous risk. But that genie is out of the bottle. We're not putting it back in. So the question now is, how do we harness it in the most productive and positive ways we can? And when I say the genie is out of the bottle, let me share this thought. So I don't know how old all of you are. I'm 51, and I got out of law school in 1994, and I was fortunate enough to just happen to be working as a young attorney trying to pay off my law school loans at a law firm that did very early internet law. I was there at the birth of the commercial internet, when it was commercialized, when it was privatized in the early Clinton administration. Just fortunate timing, and I kind of found my mission in life. I'm only 51, and that's only half my life ago. In 25 years, the advent of the commercial internet was only 25 years ago, even just a little bit less than 25 years. In 25 years, this infrastructure and this set of services and this new way of communicating has fundamentally transformed our economy. There is not a single sector of our economy that hasn't been changed by it, other than maybe healthcare, and that is coming, hopefully for the best. That may be the only significant sector where that hasn't happened. And at the same time as it has increasingly become the platform of our economy, this infrastructure and these services have transformed our democracy. It's transformed all kinds of other things, but I think of those as the two most consequential buckets: our economy and all the different sectors in it, and our democracy. And that's pretty darn important. In all kinds of ways. I mean, civic engagement is completely different than it is when I was a college student. I see the way my kids interact with their peers, the way they consume news, the way they learn about things, the way they debate issues, and it is dramatically different to what I was doing when I was in my early 20s, before the birth of the commercial internet. And sometimes when people say to me, "What do you mean it's transformed our democracy?" I'll give you this as an illustration. It is really inconceivable that there would be, absent the internet, a President Trump. And it is inconceivable that there would have been, absent the internet, a President Obama. In both cases, the internet was foundational and transformative to their campaigns and to their victories. It doesn't matter what your politics is, your life, whether we like it or not, in terms of living in this democracy and the choices we make as participants in this democracy, have been changed by the internet. That's utterly, enormously consequential. That's so extraordinary that we just have to engage it. We have to think about what it looks like into the future. So that's sort of my second framing thought for all of you, in addition to thinking of this and how it relates to electricity. All right, now let me jump into my slides. Given all that, where are we and what are the pieces that we need to understand in terms of what this will mean in the future and how we maximize it and how we leverage it? So I'll start with this thought, which is that my focus is on infrastructure. It's not on technology. From my standpoint, this is really an issue of infrastructure. My mobile phone is a device. My laptop is a device. The network in my office is an in-office network. They are all enabled and made possible by the fact that there is infrastructure. The fiber network that you are building here in Culver City is an infrastructure investment. There's technology layered on top of it, but what really matters about it is infrastructure. And what separates the broadband world and the broadband world that is ready for the future and the development and the growth that will happen over the internet from the parts of the world that will not see that is infrastructure. And the reason for that is it is one thing to sit somewhere and develop and to devise innovations and to write code and to do all of the creative things that creative people do. But if you do not have the platform on which to do it, it's not going to happen. The internet was born in the United States. It developed in the United States. It was designed in the United States. And the technologies that underlie it in a broadband era are of the United States. But what is happening in our era, and has now been happening for more than 10 years, is that we have fallen significantly behind many of our competitor nations, not in designing things like Facebook, not in developing applications, not in developing games or content or anything like that, but in building the underlying infrastructure that is the platform for all of that, that has been the platform for all of these changes. And at some point when we no longer have the most powerful and the most capable and the most open platform, some of that innovation is going to happen elsewhere. Some of that is already happening. But there was a time when it was all happening here, and that is no longer the case. So with that, give me just a moment. So let me share with you why I think this is such a consequential infrastructure issue and why I think Culver Connect is a particularly creative and important response and reaction to the core infrastructure issues and the heart of it. And to do that, I'd like to show you what the internet as an infrastructure matter, which is a backbone networks of roads of various sizes, some of them very big, some of them very small, what that looks like on a global scale and how what you are doing here in Culver City fits into that. And when I say roads, I don't actually mean roads. I am using an analogy that has existed since the early days of the internet, which is an analogy to roads and highways and so on. And I think you've all heard that. At this time, it sounds very dated, but the information superhighway, the language of the Clinton administration at the time that the internet was commercialized was an analogy to roads, to great big roads. And in some cases, the infrastructure on which we communicate and on which we participate in all of these things that we do on the internet is analogous to great big superhighways. In some cases, it's superhighways of a scale and size that we can't even contemplate, we can't get our minds around. And in some cases, that network of roads looks a little bit more like the Santa Fe Trail, and you could not put a car on it in any way possible. It's walkable, hikeable, and maybe traversable by mule or horse. So let me show you what this looks like, starting at the global level. This is the backbone of the internet as an international matter. These are the major fiber optic cables that connect all of the different parts of the world and the continents of the world to each other. And what you can see from this is, not just because the United States is in the middle of this map, as it so often is in maps that are generated here in the United States, but in many ways the United States is at the middle of this map for purposes of the fiber optics coming into the country and going out of the country. I worked on a project at one point in this part of South America, and our biggest challenge was not distribution of the internet within the country, although that was a huge challenge, massive one. But the fact that in order to even get there, to connect them to the rest of the world, they were dependent on just a couple of lines running up the South American coast and connecting up through the Caribbean to the United States. You can see what the internet backbone in this way looks like. And these are massive fiber optic cables, for the most part, that go under the water and connect us to other continents. A communication that I send from here, there's lots of communications across the country too, but a communication might actually traverse other countries before coming back to another part of the United States, although that's less likely in an American context than it is if you're in another part of the world. But 10 or 12 years ago, the American part of this, at the center of this, was a lot more dominant looking than it is now. The world, in some ways, is catching up to us as the internet has become a global phenomenon. Now, that's the international picture. The national picture, and this is what we call long-haul fiber. I mean, if I'm using too much jargon, please stop me or ask questions. What I showed you before was the undersea cables, the international connections. This is long-haul connectivity within the United States, and these are the really big bundles of fiber that connect our major metro areas to each other. And in particular, you've got very robust and resilient north-south infrastructure, usually lying along major highways, so I-5 on the west coast, 95 on the east coast, etc. Wherever there's rights of way, wherever it's most cost effective to build and maintain. And then you've got some relatively robust cross-country infrastructure as well, also lining up with major interstate highways, Route 90, Route 80, Route 70, etc. And then in our more dense parts of the country, as you can see, the California coast, Washington State, parts of Texas, Florida, and the bulk of the East Coast, you've got a greater density of this kind of infrastructure because you've got a greater density of population and market and demand. And this is the backbone of the broadband internet in the United States. These are the major digital highways, and they really are superhighways in the sense that Al Gore meant back in 1996. They are superhighways that carry the massive traffic, that connect the big cities to each other, that connect the big companies to each other, and that are the backbone of the network. Think of this as the skeleton. At a regional level, what you then have is, again using jargon, what policymakers will call middle mile fiber. And what this means is, using the analogy to the highway system, the major state highways and roads, the digital version of that, again, primarily fiber optic communications that will connect cities and towns within a region. Are you hearing a lot of feedback from this? Is it okay? All right. I just want to be sure everybody can hear me okay. Let me know if not. So this is obviously not California, but this gives you a sense of what this would look like in a particular part of the Midwest as across a 3-state area where you have this connectivity connecting these major areas. This is not really long haul. From Wichita to Kansas City is not a long haul route. It's more what's called a middle mile route. But this then allows the big connectivity that's coming across on the interstate highway that is going through Kansas City on its way east or on its way west to be distributed to other cities like Wichita, like Omaha. Denver is on that major backbone route. And that middle mile has another component. Middle mile is frequently even more local than that. And this is here now within a city or within a region. The middle mile fiber will connect major areas within that region. In the context of, let's say, Kansas and Missouri, it might be connecting modest-sized towns. In the context of a major metropolitan area, like the Los Angeles metropolitan area, it might be connecting major facilities within neighborhoods in a city like Culver City. This is, within the Midwest, effectively what you have built here in Culver City. That is what Culver Connect is. It is this backbone, not the long-haul fiber, not connecting the big cities, but connecting parts of a community to each other still in a backbone way and getting to critical locations, but not yet getting to every home and business. One last piece of jargon, and then I will move on from this slide. Last mile. Last mile is now the piece that goes from the middle mile to the homes, to the businesses. And here the analogy, continuing the road analogy, the analogy is to neighborhood streets, alleys, and driveways. Right? This is the way that this gets distributed now to our houses. And it might be in a wireless way. The middle mile comes to a wireless pole or tower, and the signal gets distributed to my home or to my business in a wireless way, but it might also be over a wire. And there will be a wire into just about every home and business in America. The capabilities of the wires are different, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's the last mile component. And if there is no middle mile, even if you have last mile, your last mile is an island, right? If you have only this, right, these big backbone routes going into major locations like 1 Wilshire Boulevard here, and you have the distribution to the home and business in the neighborhood, but you don't have that middle mile between those two things, then you have this fundamental disconnect. Or if you don't have robust middle mile, if this is weak, older infrastructure that's not particularly capable, then you again have this disconnect. If that is not present, or that is not really strong and able to carry quite a lot of resilient traffic, then you're not going to get very good service to the home or business. That is the piece that Culver City has built, and it is a critical piece of the puzzle. Good so far? Right. Okay. All right. Excellent. Again, please stop me. I'm not going to talk about satellite in any detail, but I threw this in case anybody has questions, because there are always questions about satellite. So if and when that comes up, please feel free to ask me. Just suffice it to say that for the moment, satellite is not in any way a meaningful alternative or competitor to the technologies that we're going to talk about and the infrastructure, the terrestrial infrastructure that is so critical for our communities to compete in the global economy and do all the things that broadband infrastructure enables on the economic side, but in all the other ways that I hinted at as well as that democratic discourse piece. Now, here's a lot of jargon for you, and I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on this, other than to say, well, I'm going to give you 10 minutes on this one, but stop me at any point if it's too much. I specialize in trying to make sense of this graphic, which was designed by engineers in my company, and needs some explanation, but it's actually really useful and helpful. This is a graphic that attempts to illustrate the different kinds of technologies that we find, or the different kinds of infrastructure and technologies that we find in the middle mile and in the last mile in our communities, and how they differ from each other. And the reason I want to show you this and explain it is because I think it's going to help you to understand what it is that you've built here, what Culver Connect represents, and why it is a best-in-class form of infrastructure, as well as a future-proof infrastructure that's going to pay dividends to this community for a long time to come. Let me show you why that is. So this graphic does a few different things. It's an illustration of all these different technologies of the internet era. And it starts over here. This is a line that shows us broadband or internet speeds, starting here at 50 kilobits per second, then going up to a megabit per second, that is 1,000 kilobits, and then going to a gigabit per second, that is 1,000 megabits. It's obviously not proportional, right? Not anything close to that. And this speaks to a range of different speeds through different kinds of technologies. It is also, really interestingly, I think, a timeline. It's a timeline in the sense that increasingly the consumer expectation of broadband in the home, and certainly even for small businesses, the need and expectation of broadband in the business is in the range of a gigabit and beyond. This is the current era in which expectations have evolved to the gigabit and higher speeds. But if you look back to slower speeds, looking back in time, what you have here is 50 kilobits per second. 54 kilobits per second is the speed of the dial-up modem. Remember when I talked about what the past 25 years have meant for us? That's 1995, 1996. That is the advent of the commercial internet. And for many of us here in this room, although some of you are younger than me and may not remember this, but that was how we first connected to the internet. That was the way we engaged with it, and that seemed very standard and customary. This is the movement we have made over the past 25 years. The challenge is that not all of us have made that move, and let me show you what I mean by that. So here's 1995. The internet takes many of the companies that we now think as fundamental to the internet entirely by surprise. As a commercial matter, nobody anticipated just how enormously transformative it was going to be. I don't know if some of you will remember this. 1994, 1995, the most exciting technology was the CD-ROM drive. You had companies that were spending all their time thinking about that and planning for that as the next step in evolution in certain kinds of sharing and transmission of information. And then the internet happened. And in this shocking way, became this unbelievably powerful commercial force in relatively short order. The way it happened was that we happened to have phone networks all over the country that were connected to power networks, coming back to electricity, that allowed for computers to be connected to the network, and through this dial-up modem, a network of copper wires that had been built by the phone companies in the late 19th century and the early 20th century now became capable of transmitting data at what we now consider to be very slow speeds, but still, it was hugely exciting and important at the time. You had this flourishing of commercial activity around it, website development, communications, email, AOL, CompuServe, that very exciting moment in all of our lives. Made possible because there was a wire into just about every home in America, and that was a copper wire owned by the phone company that had, in many cases, been paid for by the federal government in order for there to be universal service in a phone environment. And because those wires were there, dating back again to the early 20th century, and because there was electricity there as well, it made all of this possible. By the way, there were some places where those wires did not exist, primarily on native lands in Indian country, and in many cases that is still the case. But for the most part, the great majority of the United States had that infrastructure. And that was the phone companies. And it caught them as much by surprise as anyone else. But there was an immediate spate of development as it became clear just how enormously consequential this was going to be, just as a commercial matter for the companies. And what you had happen at that point was an arms race between two different kinds of companies. One is the phone company trying to figure out, we own this market now, how do we stay ahead of it? And the other is the cable company, looking at this, seeing this opportunity and trying to figure out how it could profit from it as well. And what happened in this moment is that the phone companies, understanding that cable was developing technology, the phone companies developed a set of technologies called digital subscriber line, or DSL. And in some parts of Culver City, this is still the way you would get internet service from AT&T primarily, but also in some places from Frontier, over DSL networks that use those old copper lines, but by using new kinds of equipment, managed to get to faster speeds. And in the same time period, the cable industry, which had networks that had been built in the 1970s and 80s for purposes of video, right, one-way video, that's what cable television was. By the way, note that I said 1970s and 80s, right, as opposed to late 19th century, early 20th century, which is when the phone networks were built. The cable networks, and here in this market that is currently Charter or Spectrum is the brand name that they use, cable industry developed a technology called DOCSIS, or cable modem. Doesn't matter what DOCSIS means, but a very innovative technology that allowed the cable industry to use those networks from the 80s that had been developed for one-way video service, right, for me to get HBO or for me to get TNT or whatever it is, and to, with the cable modem, then allow them to go two-way and become transmission media for data services for the internet. And these two competing technologies started to roll out in about 1999. 1999 early adopters in some markets, 2001, 2002, widespread deployment, widespread adoption. That's the birth of the broadband era, 1999 approximately. These were the first broadband technologies, much faster, literally broad transmission media as opposed to narrow in the dial-up era. And that's the moment at which this became a race between two different kinds of companies, phone company on the one hand, the cable company on the other hand, both of whom are now in the internet business, most consequentially, and the race is to see who can get the most customers with the most robust technology. And the answer about who gets the most customers is a little bit more complicated, but I think you can see who won the technology race. If this is DSL, or the phone company's technology, and that is cable modem, or the cable company's technology, cable companies just had a massive advantage because they had newer networks built 70 or 80 years later using newer infrastructure that were just capable of faster speeds. And this explains, I think, to some degree, for those of you who live here in Culver City, tells you something about what you have here. This is what AT&T operates, and AT&T has continued to push toward faster speeds over time. If this is 1999, this is where we are in 2019, 20 years later. But at the same time, companies like Charter and Comcast, Charter Spectrum here in Culver City, have, using cable modem technology and their cable networks, their cable infrastructure, managed to achieve significantly faster speeds. And in the current era, where that DOCSIS 3.1, that's the current generation of cable modem, has been deployed everywhere that Comcast has infrastructure in the United States, and Charter Spectrum is in the midst of upgrading its systems to that technology, capable of much faster speeds than the phone companies. One more piece that I think is really consequential as you think about this, for purposes of Culver City, is that phone companies looked at this and understood it very early on. They understood that they had a structural disadvantage in terms of the way they had these old copper networks that were not capable of the same broadband speeds as the cable companies did. And in some markets, they just tried to get the best speeds out of DSL that they possibly could, understanding that they would probably just compete for price-conscious consumers at a lower price. But in some markets, they realized that in order to compete with the cable companies, they were going to have to upgrade their infrastructure really significantly. And the upgrade of that infrastructure was not that you continue to use that copper, but that you replace that copper with fiber optics. That's what's up top there. That is what Verizon did here in Culver City 10, 12 years ago. Now that's a network that Verizon then sold to Frontier, but in about 30% of Culver City, what you have is a network that is now owned by Frontier, was originally owned by Verizon or its predecessors, but upgraded by Verizon and now owned and operated by Frontier. That is fiber to the premises. And now 1 minute on fiber to the premises, and then I promise I will move on from this slide. Fiber to the premises is the holy grail of communications infrastructure, and I'm happy to report is what fiber is what you are building as a community here, as a public matter in Culver City. If these old DSL networks are on old phone company copper lines, a transmission medium developed in the late 19th century, the cable modem networks are on what's called hybrid fiber coaxial infrastructure, the networks that were deployed in the late 70s and early 80s. What fiber represents is a much better, much more capable, more resilient, and very importantly, more scalable transmission medium that now, again, it's infrastructure. It's the same set of, it's wires out there underlying the network. It's the wires that make up the network in your community, but it is capable of much, much faster speeds and of scaling to faster speeds as time passes. So where we are now is that the fiber, you see that oval will continue out on a nearly infinite basis out off the screen here. As new technologies are developed that take advantage of it, it will be capable of scaling or adapting to those much faster speeds. A gigabit, easy. 10 gigabits, easy. 100 gigabits, eminently possible. There's no market for that right now. Nobody wants that. Nobody will be willing to pay for that. That does not have any need, but no one in the home. Thank you, John. That's a very good point. I'm talking about consumers now, and I'm going to come to businesses in a moment because that's very important. Businesses, yes, all the time. This is basic. This is a standard for even a modest-sized business. Government users been using 10 gigabit connectivity for 10 years already. So, but I'm from a consumer standpoint, we're expecting this, and we will soon be expecting beyond this. But that fiber will enable it, will adapt it, no matter how far we go, and it will do so for many, many decades to come. It's not a technology, again, not a technology. Technologies come and go. The technology that allows for 10 gigabit service will then evolve into the technology that allows for 100 gigabit. That's the equipment that goes on the fiber, but the fiber itself is the infrastructure, and it's capable of supporting all of those technologies into the future. The other networks are not, and the reason is because the infrastructure just does not have the same capabilities. It's older, and it's based on older technologies and older designs. So that's an incredibly important thing to think about. From the standpoint of a business, I have a small business just outside Washington, D.C. of 35 people. We could not function without fiber. And we're a small business. We're not a very large enterprise. It's inconceivable to me that we could ever locate anywhere again where we did not have fiber. This is just a basic standard for most businesses, depending on what they do, but increasingly more and more. In a residential environment, these kinds of speeds are necessary for people who are doing home-based business, but they're also necessary for people who are teleworking, telecommuting, and so on. And then of course, for gamers. That's an aside. That's the primary, I think, residential use from a non-business standpoint of this kind of capacity. One more point about this, maybe two more points about this. First thing is, you should know the picture in rural America is much different than this, and I won't go into any detail at all other than to say that in many parts of rural America, this is all there is. That's it. Even the middle mile is a huge challenge. May not be fiber at all, but certainly the last mile, at best it'll be DSL. In some parts of rural America, there's not even that, where the DSL service is the equivalent of what I would have considered acceptable at the beginning of 1999 or in late 1998. It's a much more challenging picture, and the cable and infrastructure just doesn't exist in those rural markets. It was only built in metropolitan markets, unlike the phone networks, which were built everywhere. So just understand that those of us who live in metropolitan areas are in a much, much better place in that regard. We may even have something that resembles competition as between a cable company and a phone company in some of our communities. But in rural areas, competition is a pipe dream, and just having adequate service would be a big deal. Second thing that I should mention, the cable infrastructure is really, it's very capable. You can see it can get to some really good speeds, but it doesn't go everywhere. It goes everywhere where there are residential premises, but not necessarily to small business areas. Because remember, it was built out for cable television service, right, for people to get HBO. And unless you were a sports bar or another kind of business that required a cable feed, there really was no business case to build a network that would then provide one-way video to businesses. They just weren't customers for one-way video. And that is still the case, that in many small and medium business areas, there's not that same level of infrastructure that there might be to a home. And finally, one last point is, below the line are wireless services as opposed to wireline, which is above the line. And I will say just only one or two things about this. This is where we are currently in terms of the current generation of mobile service and the services that we are all getting, certainly in metropolitan areas, the kinds of speeds we can get. And you can see, I can stream Netflix on my phone. I'm going to get a huge bill at the end of the month. No question, right? Because they're metering me, unlike my fiber service at home or my cable modem service at home. But I can stream Netflix in the current environment. Can't run a small business, though. Just can't do it. No conceivable way that my business could function using only this. No conceivable way a hospital could function using only this. And then as we move into the next generation of wireless, about which there is a lot of speculation, and I declined to speculate half an hour ago about what the future of the internet looked like, and I think there's a lot of speculation and hype coming from the industry about what the future of wireless communications looks like. You've probably all heard the term 5G, and you've heard all kinds of excitement and thrill around what 5G will be. It may be all those things. We don't know yet because it really hasn't been deployed. We're in the very, very early stages of it being deployed. But even if it is capable of the speeds that the industry is postulating and is suggesting to policymakers and to consumers, what will make that feasible is the fact that the wireless connectivity will be backed up by a wire. Critically important point here. There is no robust or fast wireless service without a wire, particularly in an area that is dense like this where you have a lot of users. If I pick up my phone and I connect to the internet to check a website, or if I call my husband in Maryland, I will speak on that phone, it's a mobile phone. That wireless signal will connect to an antenna that is on the roof of a building, most likely, or perhaps on a tower or a monopole somewhere here within 1/8 of a mile, most likely, in Culver City. And at that antenna, it will then travel from there over a wire. This is known as backhaul. Literally, all of the wireless traffic will go to that antenna and then will be aggregated there and hauled back to the internet backbone. And it'll travel across the country. Remember that? It'll travel across the country on a wire, on a fiber wire, all the way to somewhere in Maryland within 1/8 of a mile or so of my home in Bethesda, Maryland. My husband is talking on his mobile phone to me. The connection will then be wireless for that last 1/8 of a mile. And we will get pretty robust service, decent service. If I'm connecting over the internet and I need more capacity than I would need with just a phone signal, that connection will travel to a data center somewhere on this network, over a wire. Only that last 1/8 of a mile or so, maybe even less than that, will be wireless. And if it comes in really, really fast, the reason that it is so fast, and I think, wow, the performance of my mobile service is really good, is because it's connecting really close to me to a wire. That's a really important thing to note. The further away that fiber is from the wireless user, the slower the speeds are going to be and the less capacity, the less capability that network will have. And I hope I'm actually getting this across. I hope I'm not stumbling over trying to make this point, because it's a really consequential point, which is that you can't have this unless you have that. If not all the way to the premises, then pretty densely and deeply into your community. And when you here in Culver City are building backbone middle mile fiber infrastructure as a means of serving your businesses and supporting and protecting the vitality of your economy in the long run, you are at the same time as creating that connectivity also building the infrastructure that is likely to be at the heart of your 5G future and beyond that, whatever comes beyond 5G. Possibly it'll be called 6G. We don't know. We don't know what it looks like yet. We have actually very little idea of what it looks like. And that took longer to make that point than I wanted to, but I think that is in some ways the most important thing to know about wireless. Whatever that wireless communication looks like, it requires a wire. And if it's going to be a good wireless communication, it requires a wire really nearby. Okay, that's a lot on this slide, but I hope it gives you a context for understanding where you are as a community, within the United States, and how your network potentially fits in. Please.
What are there was the GEO satellite and LEO
Ah.
satellite and white spaces.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So TV white spaces, it's a wireless technology that's used in some rural areas where the economics simply do not exist for wires. It is barely broadband speeds. It's really not broadband speeds at all. In a market like Culver City, it's not something you'd think about. The projects I've been involved in that involve TV white spaces are in Appalachia, in very mountainous areas where it's just not possible to build wires, or it's prohibitively expensive. It has very good propagation characteristics. So it can go through trees, it can go through mountains, it can go through doors and windows, but it's not very fast. And in different wireless technologies have different propagation characteristics and different benefits. The ones that are fast tend to have more challenges going through things like trees and leaves. The ones that are slower are better for that. So it's a really, really rough set of trade-offs that you never have to worry about when you have a wire. Basically, we all need the best of all possible wires to all of our homes and business and institutions, and then the wireless can sit on top of that, so we have both of them. They are not substitutes for each other. They are critical pieces of what it means to participate in a 21st century economy and democracy. LEO and GEO. GEO is geostationary satellites. LEO is low Earth orbit satellite. You've probably all heard of these GEO satellite services like HughesNet. They're expensive, they're really slow. If you live in a place like Culver City, chances are you're not using them. If you live in remote parts of New Mexico, that may be the only option you have. There's a possibility and a certain amount of excitement that the low Earth orbit satellite constellations that are in development right now, you can see this is also not to scale, by the way, but much, much closer to the Earth, many more satellites, much smaller. Companies like SpaceX and Facebook and OneWeb are pioneering efforts to try to get these very large constellations of small satellites out in low Earth orbit with the idea that they will then provide competitive broadband service. It is possible. If they can make this work from a technological standpoint, and it's not yet proven, by the way. SpaceX has just put up their first few satellites, so we don't know how it's going to work from a technology standpoint. If it will work, could, but and if they can make the economics work, right? Very expensive to place a satellite in space, but if they do, it could potentially offer another option at a much faster speed. But this is really where we are with satellite right now. That's companies like HughesNet and Viasat, and it's expensive and it's slow. And part of the reason why it's slow is because it's just so far from the Earth that it takes a very long time for the signal to come back down, go back up, and so on. So again, if you're in a rural area, this is more consequential. If you're in Culver City, chances are it's not something you're even thinking about, and it's pretty pricey relative to what you can get in terms of terrestrial service. Now, let me show you why your fiber network could potentially be so consequential for many of your businesses, and why fast speeds and fiber are really important even for small businesses, for residential consumers, and so on. This is not even a particularly sophisticated function that is being illustrated here. Downloading and uploading a 5 gigabyte file is about the size of a DVD. So businesses will do this and more constantly, depending on what kind of business it is, on an ongoing basis. But in order to give you a sense of what these speeds might look like and how the different networks function and what they offer, we're illustrating here based on a 5 gigabyte file. So different technologies and the speeds that it takes. The red bar is the upload time, so how long it takes to send the data from my laptop up to the network, up to the internet itself. The blue bar is the download time. And here you start to get a sense of the dramatic difference between something like 4G wireless, which is the current generation of mobile wireless that we all have. We are not yet in a 5G environment. None of us owns a 5G capable phone, and there are in Sacramento a few select areas where there have been 5G pilots tried, but we do not have widespread deployment of 5G. So in a 4G environment, this is where we are. A 5 gigabyte file to upload, 7.5 hours about, to download 75 minutes. With fiber, which as I said, enormously scalable, fiber configured to deliver speeds of 100 megabits, that's about 9 minutes. And most of the companies that offer services over fiber these days do it in a symmetrical way, so I'm looking at symmetrical speeds here as opposed to much faster speeds for down and slower speeds for up, which has been a commercial standard for cable and phone companies. Fiber at a gigabit per second, less than 53 seconds. Fiber at 10 gigabits per second, less than 5 seconds, just based on the equivalent of uploading or downloading all the data in a DVD. It starts to give you a sense of what this means from a business standpoint, and I have to remind myself also, like I'm standing in the heart of the entertainment industry here, which you all think of, know and think about all the time. It takes a little bit of recognition for me coming from the East Coast, but we are talking now about companies located here in Culver City for whom uploading or downloading a 5 gigabyte file is absolutely nothing compared to the volume of data that they might need or want. And you've all heard the stories, I'm sure, living in an area where the entertainment industry is so dominant. I still hear them in places like San Francisco about companies that work in digital media that ship hard drives here to Los Angeles by overnight mail all the time because they don't have the capacity to support sending the kinds of digital media files that they're producing all the time over the internet because the infrastructure is not there.
We've heard stories they're still transferring digital files here physically, locally.
Culver Connect will change all of that for those who are able to. That's a remarkable thing. And that, by the way, the beauty of the internet and the beauty of broadband is that it has the potential in certain cases to remove geographic constraints. For a local company here, geography is less of a constraint. Even if that digital file has to be transferred physically, it might be a walk or a drive through your traffic to get to where it needs to go. For a company in San Francisco, it's a FedEx shipment. Now, this, by the way, I think is really maybe a nice illustration of some of the peril of what we risk as a nation by not building this kind of infrastructure everywhere. Because, by the way, this is going everywhere in China, everywhere. This goes to every single location, every home, business, and institution in South Korea, and in Singapore, and in significant parts of New Zealand. But as a nation, what we really risk is if digital media can come here to the entertainment capital of the world faster from China than it can from San Francisco or from the other side of Culver City or the other side of Los Angeles, we are significantly at risk. Now we have lost something very important as an infrastructure matter because that geographic barrier that protected us economically in many ways has been eliminated. And in fact, from our standpoint, we're weaker. The geographic barrier is now one that has to do with infrastructure, and we've put ourselves at a huge disadvantage.
Well, I was going to say, I know a lot of companies, and I think maybe with Google and their Stadia thing, that's the most
That's a very good illustration. I'm assuming you're all familiar with that phrase in the cloud. It just means that things that we might have stored in our offices or locally on servers or in the past on paper is now going to be located somewhere else. And it almost doesn't matter if we've got the necessary infrastructure. It can be in a data center on the other side of the country. It can be in a data center 5 states away. It can be you might want it in a data center 5 states away in case there is some kind of natural disaster here and you need it in that other place as a backup matter. But wherever you are in the world, as long as you have available infrastructure, you can pull down from the cloud whatever that data is that you require. And over the past 10 years, so much of how businesses function has shifted to the cloud. It's not hosted locally. It's not in the office. My phone system as a small business, it really doesn't exist anymore. We don't have anything that resembles a phone anymore. We have laptops, we have mobile phones, and our phone system is a system that's hosted by Microsoft somewhere, and I have no idea where that might be. Could be anywhere, but I've got the infrastructure to my office that makes it possible for us to access that. It's true of 100 different things that businesses do all the time, and increasingly so, but it means that for businesses to take advantage of those services and to not be at a disadvantage relative to that, they need the infrastructure and the services to be able to access it. Is that understandable to everyone? Sir,
I'm curious, what is the plan for backup in the event of an intentional or accidental catastrophic failure? In other words, we have, with the government, we have various networks, but our fallback is a point-to-point radio system. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it's the Department of Homeland Security is the lead agency in it, and there's about another 100 agencies with us, and that's a fallback because under those circumstances, nothing needs to no repeater stations need to be maintained, no batteries supplied on a mountaintop. It's all point-to-point radio, so you have people at each end who can operate and people who can maintain if it becomes necessary. And that's what our fallback to fallback to fallback is.
So you're speaking of government networks in the event of emergency and public safety emergencies. What is the fallback? Or you mean locally here in Culver City?
Basically, it's for FBI, DHS, Army, Navy, and so on and so forth. But I notice as we're talking about putting more and more fiber, so to speak, it becomes a vulnerability also. And what is the position that we have or that you propose to have a fallback in the event of, again, accidental or intentional catastrophic failure?
All of those wireless networks, there's a pretty significant foundational part of it that is a wire, and that is these fiber networks. So I'm not a network engineer, and I'm not a public safety professional, but I talk to them all the time, and I employ them. I mean, the weaknesses of this network are in the electric grid. We lose power, we lose all of this, right? That's a huge, huge flaw, and that we need to be really concerned about. But the nature of the communications infrastructure itself and the fiber is that design engineers will sometimes call it self-healing. The more you have, the more redundancy you have, the more networks you have, the more providers you have with those networks going to different places, the more you can rely on a redundant connection. Funnily enough, today being the 18th anniversary of 9/11, in Lower Manhattan on 9/11, when the Twin Towers fell, Verizon's central office, located in the basement of one of them, was destroyed. Verizon's infrastructure, which was not self-healing, it was network going out in all directions from that location in Lower Manhattan, was entirely lost because the core of the network there at the central office was lost. The city of New York happened to have built, over the previous 3 years, a very robust set of fiber rings for purposes of criminal justice and education to connect community colleges and high schools to each other, and then also to connect them to various kinds of criminal justice locations like courts. And the network was built in a ring, and when the site at the Twin Towers was destroyed, the traffic on the ring just turned around and went in the other direction. So New York's network stayed up. I don't know that I'm giving you a very good answer to your question, and I think John probably has one for you.
I also just wanted to mention that Culver Connect was designed with redundancy and resiliency. We built rings, we built 3 separate rings, so just as she described. So, I mean, you can't accomplish perfection, but we built in as much redundancy and resiliency as we could.
The design is very much a future-proof and robust design. It's a prudent investment. It's underground, which makes it much less vulnerable to certain kinds of attacks because it's much less accessible, less vulnerable to natural disaster, and designed very much for that self-healing ring architecture that I talked about and illustrated with what happened in New York. I think the point that there's no perfect means of protecting anything is a really good one, but I worry way more. If I wanted to shut down the internet in the United States, I'd attack our electric grid. That's a much, much greater vulnerability in every way, and that makes us vulnerable in really significant ways as a nation. And sir, you had a comment?
Yeah, pardon my ignorance, but we have this fiber in Culver City. But how do I get access?
Yes. So let me tell you what you have in Culver City, which is a great question. So the first thing is you have Spectrum in Culver City, which operates a cable modem network along those lines. And it is capable right now of delivering 100 megabits per second, and that's a product that they currently market. And they will upgrade it to get to faster speeds of up to 1 gigabit per second. You also have 2 phone companies operational in Culver City at the moment. One is Frontier, that has fiber to many homes, about in the 30% range is what they report in Culver City. And then the other one is AT&T. And for that other 70% of homes, either AT&T or Frontier is offering DSL speeds. But that's a picture of what you have on the commercial side. And then you've got all the mobile networks, obviously. What the city has built is something that looks like this graphic here, which is to say, it's much prettier than this, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture for you, although it's on the brochure, the card that they have at the desk there. It is a network that connects various parts of the city through 3 major rings, and that is designed for economic development and related purposes in order to make Culver City the kind of place that businesses that require sophisticated communications will want to come and will want to stay, and the ones that are already here will have no reason to leave. In the way that I described, I can never relocate to a place that doesn't have fiber, even my little company of 35 people. That is what Verizon Fios has meant for Bethesda, Maryland, which is where I'm located, and that's what you are accomplishing here in Culver City. But that network does not get to every home and business. The city's own network goes to these economic development target areas that were of particularly critical importance from the standpoint of economic vitality. What the city has in mind, and let me ask the city manager and anyone else on who would like to speak for the city rather than me speaking, but that infrastructure then can serve as a platform for private entities to provide services to some of those businesses, but also for them to then use it as a tool for getting into the neighborhood and for the private entities to then deploy themselves to other businesses and to residential premises. That's a long answer to your question, but I didn't want to be a buzzkill entirely.
It doesn't sound like I'm going to get it.
Well, no. Like, I mean, John can talk about this more, but we're sort of in a process where we're considering.
I don't know how quickly it will be.
You know,
and we're in the midst of. We just built the backhaul, and we built it initially to serve business.
Amazon.
Not just Amazon, but they're targets. I mean, and they can make use of fiber. As time goes on, and as we are able to, we just started with this. As time goes on, as we're able to cover the costs that we've invested so far, I'm certain that over time this is going to grow. It's going to grow organically. It's going to be a challenge to get fiber to the home because of the fact that we're 100 years old and that there's not much room in the right of way. I mean, you've got to think about running fiber to every single home in the city, what that's going to take, and what path will it take? Will it have to go under the sidewalk? There's no.
But, I mean, we have wires bringing us electricity.
Well, if you want to put it up if you want to string it up in the air on poles, that you really want to put fiber underground. Just like we've built the network underground. Ideally, it's possible. We as a community can make a decision at some point that we're willing to string it on poles. That is potentially possible. You still can't. Those poles aren't available. I don't think everywhere either. That's not going to be the entire solution.
And it's not easier to
answer. I will tell you that it's not going to be easy to get it to homes. But we've got to start somewhere. We had to start with the middle mile fiber, and you've got to think. I mean, she's talking about, and I agree with her that over the coming years and decades, this thing is going to grow, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. But we are studying it. We are talking to one company right now that has some interest. I could just tell it's going to be challenging to get it to a home anytime soon.
Well, and from a political perspective, like there are a number of council members who are very interested in getting it to homes as quickly as possible. But as John mentioned, there are these technical, roadblocks. But if we can bring some economic vitality to the city by having this network be available to businesses, maybe that can open the door when it's completely solvent and paying for itself, for us to think about branching off more.
We wouldn't have any shot at getting it to the homes. We don't get the middle mile working. We're trying to get the middle mile working right now. And then that gives us the opportunity to move to residential. Right now we're just focused. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's fine. We're working on that middle mile she's talking about. We've just constructed it, and we're at the point where we have to have it so that it's operating in a fiscally sound manner. We've got to do that first. And then I think we're going to be able to look at I know at some point we're going to be pursuing residential. I'm certain it's going to come. It's just a question of when. Ken or Colin? Ken?
So
right now,
you guys come up, will you just go to this mic or that mic
Try
over there?
to record this.
Sorry,
I
we
forgot.
don't have mobile mics tonight.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Right now, there's DOCSIS 3.1 that is possible through these cable companies right now that can get you real close to, the speeds at their homes, like up to a gig. What's the limitation for those companies right now? Is it that they don't have their own middle mile backbone to be able to deliver that? And if that is the case, what about opening up our middle mile even to them? Because they already have the wires strung into every single home. So just getting
our middle mile, we will sell fiber to anyone. That was the whole point. We've built an open access dark fiber.
So to companies that are already billing us.
The middle mile, for a company like Spectrum, the middle mile is
So it's not, from a spectrum standpoint, the fastest product, based on my research, that they offer here in Culver City is 100 megabits. With DOCSIS 3.1, they will be able to push to up to a gigabit. Remember, there's always an up to number, by the way, so it doesn't mean you're actually getting that for the most part. But they're not yet DOCSIS 3.1 in Culver City, to my knowledge, but they will be at a certain point. The constraint, I don't think, is the middle mile. It has to do with business strategy as much as with anything else. And the gigabit services that are available here from Frontier, for example, are priced in the hundreds of dollars, which, and it doesn't mean that they're necessarily trying to sell that service. They may not think the market's here yet.
And I want to validate this Frontier number. Does anyone here have Frontier service, that speed? I don't either. I know that's what the data says, but
to my knowledge, they don't do it anymore for residential because it's not possible. So they stopped doing it in that line in the west part of Culver City.
I will dig into that. I will do that research because Frontier is claiming, and the various aggregators of this data are showing that about 30% of Culver City has fiber to the home. If that's not actually accurate, that's pretty significant.
The only thing we've done is the west side because that's the biggest standalone on that.
but no one in the room. I've never run into anyone that has this.
It's very possible that's not the case, in which case Frontier service is much like AT&T's, which is DSL. And you would know better than these aggregators of data that are reporting that they're at 30%. And I think this gentleman had a comment on that topic.
Has 1 gig service to businesses already. And
They have one, George, they have 1 gig to home, but when you meter it, it's like 160. It's not one.
The business spectrum, and that definitely reaches 1 gig.
You do get it at business level, but they sell gig at the home, but.
Yeah, it costs a lot more.
So business products tend to be not just different speeds and prices, but also other kinds of attributes. Like you get a guaranteed speed in some cases, depending on what the business product is. It's a very different market. The question is also, do they have that everywhere? Chances are it's not to all businesses. In fact, we know it's not to all businesses because that's what a lot of what led to the Culver Connect project, is that businesses were struggling and were facing real frustrations with locating here. And then we compete globally as communities, but we also compete with our neighbors. I work for some communities in North Carolina that are delightful places to locate if you're a business. They're wonderful. Their real estate is really affordable. All kinds of services are great, but the only business options for connectivity are DSL. And up the road in Raleigh, there's gigabit service for $70. Those communities are just sunk when it comes to attracting businesses because of what they're competing with in Raleigh. Doesn't matter. All the other factors at the end of the day are not enough. Broadband is a necessary piece of business functioning these days.
All right, I'm going to just throw my question before I forget it. So with regards to business, because my understanding, I know when the process started, there was a thought at one point that this would roll out last spring, which obviously has taken a little bit longer. But from a business standpoint, my thought is that what helps pencil this project out for the city is getting businesses that are investing as far as into the service. Is that a correct assessment, at least partly?
We're in the midst of trying to figure out who to partner with going forward. We're in the midst right now of selling fiber to businesses that can afford dark fiber, to larger businesses that can afford to contract with ISPs they're large enough that it stimulates the ISP to lease dark fiber from us. It's like we're starting up here in terms of the size of business. We're starting up here and we're making deals up here or working our way down a little bit. We're in the midst of this RFP process where we are evaluating proposals from others. Hopefully, coming out of this process, we will be able to have someone who's going to be able to offer service to the more medium and smaller sized businesses. Hopefully, within the coming months, we'll be able to communicate something along those lines. I'm struggling. It's hard to explain this in a few sentences. I'm trying to be succinct, but it's just going to take a while. I can see that it's happening. It's just slower than you want it to be, but I can see where it's coming.
So I'll ask it this way: what would you tell the majority of small businesses that are in Culver City that they were impacted when the backbone was put in place? They've kind of seen that infrastructure get laid and now are in a waiting phase. If you can.
Right now, I tell you, there are businesses right now that are calling people like Crown Castle and CenturyLink. We're leasing fiber to Crown Castle and CenturyLink as we speak to serve certain businesses in this community. So right now you could call Crown Castle or CenturyLink and tell them you want service. And if it makes sense to them at the moment, they'll decide whether it pencils for them to lease fiber from us to serve you. But there are businesses in town right now that's what's happening. Now, but that's going to be, we need to get something that's going to work for smaller businesses. But again, it's not going to happen fast because guess what? We've got to get a connection to the building. The fiber network is just a backbone. We've still got to get a lateral from the fiber network to the building. And so right now, if you're a small business, ultimately you're going to have to be willing to probably finance the lateral. You and I should spend about an hour or two going through this.
Thank you.
Can I take probably a couple more questions and then we'll need to wrap up?
Disa?
I just had two questions. One was, my memory is that the rollout was initially going to be for businesses in our schools. Is that true, that the schools will also benefit?
The fiber backbone, the fiber network has been designed and built to supply fiber to each school, and it's there at their doorstep. As a matter of fact, we talked about it in this afternoon's Ken was there, at the school district city council liaison meeting. But no, we intentionally designed it, and the fiber's there, right on the doorstep of all the schools.
So we just have to have funding to allow the schools to access?
They're going to have to figure out how to take advantage of it. Mm-hmm. Using dark fiber.
You don't know what dark fiber is.
What's dark fiber?
What is dark fiber? It just means the fiber optics themselves. I should have explained this before. Fiber is very thin strands of glass that, using lasers, using equipment, is then lit up with those lasers, with those equipment, and is then capable of carrying the data. When there's no equipment on either end, and it's just the glass, and as in the city's model, it's just leasing the glass to companies that bring their own equipment and then light it up in order to transmit services. It's actually not important. Here's the analogy. If the fiber is the highway, lighting it up means you're putting the cars on the highway. So the city is just leaving it to the companies to bring the cars. The city is making sure that the highway is there so the companies can benefit from it. That's what dark fiber is. It's detail level. It doesn't really matter. It's just a way of structuring the business here that reduces the city's risk, quite frankly. And I will say, as somebody who works in this space, I think the city's planning has been really thoughtful and and very prudent. And the staged approach of doing the backbone first and doing it in a way that is future-proof and is going to be an asset that will last for a very long time is a really nice foundation then to move on to next steps, rather than rushing to do everything at one time. To answer your question about the schools, let me just say this. Schools, for the most part, are relatively well served with broadband. And the reason for that is that as a nation, we have decided that we are going to subsidize broadband to schools. We do it through something called the E-rate program, which was created by the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and that creates this massive subsidy program called E-rate, administered out of Washington, that subsidizes the infrastructure and the services that goes to schools. So in order for schools to take advantage of the E-rate program, which provides them this great subsidy, they have to go through a very robust competitive bidding process. By having that fiber infrastructure there, what the city has done is it has created the infrastructure so lots of different companies could potentially compete for the school's business. What the schools can't do, though, if they want to get the benefit of the E-rate subsidy, bringing in money from Washington to offset what it would cost to get that connectivity, they can't just say, we're going to buy it from our favorite company or from the city or anything like that. They have to have a competitive process, but the city's infrastructure makes that competition that much more robust.
And it may, they have broadband now that serves their needs. It may be that, though, that, as Joanne was mentioning, who knows, 10 or 15 years from now, it may be like, oh my God, we got fiber, and that won't be common, and maybe they'll have an advantage in 10 or 15 years from now that none of us saw.
It may also be, they go through this bidding process every couple of years. They may not have had the bidding process since the city's fiber got to them. But the next time they put out an RFP under the E-rate program for services, there will be companies who will look at that and say, the city's got fiber there. We can lease from the city. We can put in a competitive bid. We never would have been able to do that if we had had to build the fiber ourselves. Let's go in there and compete for that business, and we're going to offer better services, more services at a lower price to the schools. There will be competition the next time around for the schools in a way that never existed before, because the infrastructure is now there and the private sector can do what it does best in some cases, which is compete.
What I saw on Facebook was that this is going till 9, and I hope you can speak very briefly. I feel so disappointed to not hear about your, I don't know what it's called, but you have some knowledge about community benefit or whatever the information was about you, and when you were interested at the very beginning, it was something. What is that? Can you say something about that?
I'm trying to remember what was in the blurb.
Yes, CLIC. Yes, it's CLIC. Thank you, Joanne. I'm sorry. Thank you, Vice Mayor.
I am happy to say this is not a challenge you have in California, but in 20 American states, there are laws that have been written that restrict the rights of municipalities, like many of your peers around the country, to do the kinds of projects that you are doing here and to be able to make decisions through your elected officials about what is in the best interests of your community. There are 20 states that have these state-level laws that restrict municipal entry into broadband, and some of them will just stop municipalities from serving residential customers, but in some cases, even public-private partnerships, dark fiber leasing of this sort, let's just say of this sort, are prohibited by state law. For the most part, those are laws that were lobbied for and in some cases written by companies that are already in those markets that don't want to face competition. And I'm happy that you're not in a place where you really have to worry about that for the most part. For those 20 states, though, it is really, really hurting their communities. So I've worked in this field for a long time, and I was the co-founder of a nonprofit that advocates, we're a coalition of public and private entities that advocate for communities to have the right to make their own decisions, as you have been able to do here in Culver City.
And I've worked in one of those states. It has to do with the politics in that particular state. States where telecom lobbies are particularly strong and effective.
So we don't have to worry about that.
No.
Okay, one last question over here.
So hypothetically, if there's some group of people that wanted to form some kind of co-op and get some fiber, is there public information about how much you charge for access and what chunks you sell it in and things like that?
Give me a call.
Okay. You don't have like your rate sheet right now?
We don't have a rate sheet.
Would you pay $1,000 to get the fiber in and then pay a monthly fee?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you can chop it up into pieces to give to other people, then sure. Like if all your neighbors on the block say, all right, it's cheaper for me to form this co-op and, you know, than it is for me to buy it from Spectrum, then yeah. But the problem is,
Spectrum charges you $50.
Yeah.
To bring in their cable.
And actually, it's not that much money when you add up. It's $1,000, and then you got to split that up between so many residents in a certain area or so many businesses in a certain area.
We're going. First, we're going to what? Give me a call. We'll talk.
And let us know when you form the co-op.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne. Everybody.